Hello ladies and gentlemen, I hope all of you are doing well. This video is something truly different, unlike anything I've ever worked on or seen produced in response to Darth Dawkins or to presuppositional apologetics in general. To my knowledge, no one has ever compiled, organized, and internally analyzed his own words the way this presentation does. The content you're about to see is completely original, built entirely from Darth's statements, definitions, and claims, examined strictly on his terms. Nothing in this video depends on rebutting Christianity, debating theology, or defending atheism. Instead, it is an internal critique, and it exposes contradictions, inconsistencies, and structural failures that arise directly within Darth's own framework, on his own terms, and based on his own statements and claims, making this analysis both unique and, in many ways, unprecedented. This is a serious internal critique of Darth Dawkins' version of presuppositional apologetics, examined strictly on its own terms. And what we're going to uncover today is not a minor inconsistency, not a quirk, not a slip of the tongue, but a structural collapse at the foundation of Darth's entire philosophical and theological framework. Let's dive in. Chapter 1. Presuppositional Apologetics lives or dies by its definition of God. Presuppositional apologetics makes a bold claim. Only the Christian God, defined as the necessary, ultimate, and self-sufficient foundation, can make sense of or ground intelligibility. So if that definition, which represents the foundation of presuppositional apologetics itself, isn't stable, if it changes, if it's unclear or inconsistent, the entire system fails before the argument even begins. The foundation isn't supposed to shift like a moving goalpost. At least, that's what the claim is. If you have been following my channel, you will notice that my most recent videos directly relate to how Darth Dawkins, aka Gary F Milne, defines his own God, which he claims is referring to the biblical God. I previously pointed out that Gary mentions, at least what he refers to, as 17 core attributes of the biblical God. I showed that Gary's list differs from, and is contradictory to, the list of Cornelis Van Til himself, and also the one mentioned by P. Mars, another online presuppositional apologist. This video will take an extremely close look at how Gary defines his God. While listening to him speak throughout thousands of videos and during the past 7+ years, I frequently hear Gary refer to a minimalist definition of God. In my studies, I have been able to locate various conversations where Gary is describing this so-called minimalist definition of God. But before we take a more detailed look at this minimalist definitions of God, the question at this point is, how does Gary himself describe this minimalist definition? When we examine the meaning of this so-called minimalist definition and what he says it's supposed to represent, this is where the first major problem begins. Across multiple recorded conversations, Gary offers multiple inconsistent explanations of what the minimalist definition is, what it does, what it includes, and how it functions. For example, Gary says it's the base properties of the God of the Bible. It's not only the necessary properties. It's the barest possible definition, including but not excluding additional attributes. It's not pluralism. It's all the attributes God has given in the New Testament. It's whatever an atheist will accept as a working term. It's not leaving out necessary properties. It's only the necessary properties. These descriptions contradict one another to such an extreme degree that they cannot all be correct. In fact, some of them are mutually exclusive. They directly negate each other. He says it's the bare minimum, but also not limited to necessary properties. He says it includes all New Testament attributes, but also that it only includes a tiny subset. He says it must be agreed upon, but also that it already reflects the biblical God's full nature. He says it's not pluralism, but defines God in ways no biblical theologian would recognize. If the meaning of the definition is incoherent, then the definition itself cannot possibly be coherent. And that brings us to the bombshell. Chapter 2, The Inconsistent Versions. As we listen to Gary describe his minimalist definition, these are not small wording differences. These are different lists with different attributes, different ontological roles, different metaphysical commitments, and different conceptions of God. Based off of the above, the truth becomes self-evident. It is more than obvious that Gary himself cannot even clearly articulate what a minimalist definition even is, why this is a catastrophic problem to Gary's apologetics and to presuppositional apologetics as a whole. This is where presuppositionalists need to pay very close attention. In presuppositional apologetics, God must possess all essential attributes without deficit or contradiction. If even one necessary attribute is missing, then, by the presuppositionalist's own standards, the concept of God becomes not ultimate, not perfect, not necessary, not capable of grounding intelligibility. In short, the worldview collapses under its own weight. In my studies, I have been able to identify, at the very least, 14 different versions of what Gary refers to as the minimalist definition of God.
So if it's a good God, then I think the evidential problem of evil is
now,
very
my question doesn't contain that issue. Okay, when I define God, I'm defining God as that which is ultimate, eternal, a mind, and is the source of all possibility and impossibility. Whether or not that God has extended properties doesn't concern me when it comes to the denial of God. So how does that God not exist?
Okay, well, that's not how everyone understands God.
Well, that's a minimalist definition of God. Okay, now before we go on, let's just give a minimalist definition of God. Okay, so we're on the same page. I'm going to give you a definition of God that's as uncontroversial. Okay, so God is that which is eternal, ultimate, and the creator of mind and the institutor of all temporal facts. Okay, so we're going to be talking about God as creator. Now, we haven't even gotten to that. Okay, we're still dealing with a minimalist definition. Okay, God's basic character set. Okay, God is ultimate and he's eternal and the ground of all being. Okay, well, unless we're talking about some finite creature, when we talk about God in these conversations, God is going to be defined conceptually as that which is ultimate, absolute, the creator, the source of all possibility and impossibility. Okay, but unless we agree upon a minimalist definition, then we can't converse. This 4 times.
Okay, well, what I want to say now is that I feel like the God you're setting up is not the one I have in mind. So
no, sir, I gave you a minimalist definition of God. I gave you a minimalist definition of God.
Okay, well,
God is that. Okay, please don't listen to me. When we talk about God, we're going to be talking about that which is fundamental in reality and is the source of all possibility. Okay, and is a mind.
Well, the God.
When we talk about God, we're referring to God as creator. God is that which is the necessary precondition of all facts. Okay? I'm not defining God into existence. I'm just giving a minimalist definition of God. Okay? Okay. Let's define, in terms of minimalist definition, God is that which is ultimate and fundamental, the source of all possibility and impossibility, and is a mind. Okay? Now, whether or not that...
I make this commitment to you. I will defend atheism, as I have done before, if you please just give me the minimalist definition of the Christian God now.
The minimalist definition of the Christian God are all those attributes that he has given of himself in the New Testament.
Which are?
I think when you say God and I say God, I
God,
think we're
God
describing two different things.
in Western speaking English, God is defined in terms of a minimalist definition. God is that which is eternal, ultimate, the supreme being, and creator and the source of all possibility. Okay, listen to me carefully. We're going to start by defining God as an eternal mind and is the source, the primary source of all secondary states. Okay, I gave you a minimalist definition of God. God is an eternal mind that is the source of all temporal states. Do you mean a minimal definition, or do you mean
Yes, sir. Basic.
a more robust one? Well, my minimal definition,
just very basic.
a very basic definition of God is that which is the supreme being who is eternal, without beginning, non-dependent, non-derivative, and is the creator and sustainer of all things that are not himself. And he's a mind. So basically, God is the supreme being and creator that is a mind. Jacob, when we talk about God, we're talking about what is fundamental and foundational to all possibility, that God is the ground of all existence, the ground of all being. Okay? Now, that means that God is that which is fundamentally necessary, absolute, ultimate, and immutable. Now,
what do you mean by ultimate?
That God is all things derive and depend upon God.
So
now,
all things depend.
That's a minimalist representation of any God concept is going to have to include those minimalist properties. And if they don't, then we're not talking about God. So listen to me carefully, okay? God is that which is whatever is eternal, ultimate, absolute, unconditionally non-dependent, and the source and basis of all possibility and impossibility, and is a mind, okay? Whether or not that has additional properties is for another discussion. So you do not believe...
Oh, sorry.
Do you think that, Matt, do you think he is neutral toward the idea that what is fundamental to reality is a personal mind and a creator? Do you think he's neutral toward that?
I don't know about that, God, but I do know that...
No. Listen to me. That definition would be a minimalist definition that would apply.
When we listen to Gary describe it, Gary's 14 versions are not merely incomplete, they are contradictory. For example, some versions include a mind, others don't. Some include creator, others don't. Some include absolute, others don't. Some include supreme being, others don't. Some include unconditionally non-dependent, others don't. Some include ground of being, others don't. Some define God as merely fundamental, others as creator. These are not equivalent terms, and perhaps most importantly, no two versions contain the same set of attributes. Not one. This makes Gary's position definitionally unstable, and therefore unintelligible by his own standards. If no definition is consistently described, then the concept of God, as Gary describes it on his own terms, is not coherent enough to ground possibility and impossibility, a direct violation of presuppositional requirements. Gary's worldview represents a complete self-destructive failure based on its own terms. Chapter 3. How does this inconsistency directly relate to one actually being a Christian?
Are you saying
You have to believe that Jesus Christ is qualitatively God and is the second person of the triune God. That's what it means to be a Christian. If you do not believe in the Trinity and the deity of Christ, then you are not a Christian.
Gary himself declares that the Trinity and deity of Christ are non-negotiable. A person who denies them is not a Christian. His exact words, "If you do not believe in the Trinity and the deity of Christ, then you are not a Christian." This statement is fatal to Darth's own minimalist definitions because none of the 14 minimalist attribute lists include the Trinity personhood distinctions in the Godhead. Why this is devastating on Darth's own terms. Darth repeatedly says, God must be defined according to the attributes revealed in Scripture. God must have the attribute set of the God of the Bible. Non-biblical God concepts cannot ground intelligibility. Any definition that omits essential attributes is not God. The triunity of God is essential to the Christian worldview. Therefore, if the Trinity is essential and none of his 14 minimalist lists include the Trinity, then none of those 14 lists define the Christian God. Meaning, every one of his minimalist lists is heretical by his own standard. Every one of them fails to define the God of the Bible. Every one of them collapses under his own demand for biblical attributes. Every one of them is internally invalid as a grounding for intelligibility. Every one of them contradicts his own theological requirements. I think this is the single most devastating inconsistency because it strikes at the heart of presuppositionalism. If the presuppositional argument must start with the Christian God, but Gary's definitions never define the Christian God, then none of his arguments even begin. They never get off the ground. Why this point is especially deadly. In the presuppositional method, the identity of God is absolutely non-negotiable. Van Til and Bonson repeatedly emphasized, the argument must begin with the full Christian worldview, not with a trimmed-down philosophical theism. Gary does the opposite. He gives the unbeliever a non-Trinitarian, non-Christological, non-biblical, non-revealed, philosophically abstract, incomplete, man-made, revised many times, logically inconsistent, minimalist definition, and then claims it is the Christian God. That is exactly what Van Til and Bonson said must never be done. Gary says that without the attribute set of the God of the Bible, the triune God, you cannot ground intelligibility. But his 14 minimalist definitions never mention the Trinity. By Gary's own standard, every one of his minimalist lists defines a non-Christian God. Therefore, none of the 14 lists can ground intelligibility. None of them are biblical, and none of them represent the Christian worldview. Once again, on Gary's own terms, his entire system collapses. Chapter 4. Gary, Eli Ayala, and Self-Evident Truths. Ladies and gentlemen, I am going to play a couple clips for you. The first one is from about 5 years ago, related to self-evident truths. And then, afterwards, I'll explain how it directly ties into what we have just uncovered in Gary's apologetics.
You demonstrate it by accepting the revelation of the Christian God, because he's not going to give you. He's not. No, you don't, because you see, the Bible declares that God has made his existence self-evident. You have a choice. You can either accept that the creation is evidence of God, or you can suppress that truth and turn and create your alternate universe. There is nothing that is self-evident. Nothing. Okay?
Well, how do we know that?
In those two instances, I juxtaposed clips demonstrating a contradiction Gary had made. After about 3 years from the time I posted those clips, I discovered a conversation on a YouTube channel where Gary was referring to the clips I had posted.
I hear eat this.
Darth, I wanted to say a couple of comments back. When people appeal to self-evident truths, I wanted to say that self-evident truths are not worldview independent. So that self-evident truths.
Thank you. That was beautiful. Beautiful. Self-evident truths are not worldview independent.
So then when you have two people appeal to self-evident truths, they're not in agreement in like a one-to-one correspondence. Their worldview context will make those self-evident truths actually differentiate from one another. It's just that some people are unaware of the connection between, or the relation between their worldview context and what they call self-evident truths.
Excellent.
Yeah.
Everybody got
You're
that?
You're sorting
Does
immediacy.
everybody understand that?
Yeah. You're sorting immediacy within a worldview context. That's all.
Is there anyone in the room who did not understand what Eli said? And don't worry, if you don't understand it, Eli will go over it again. Okay.
I missed the last half of it. I'm sorry.
Okay, go ahead, Eli.
Well, I was saying that when people appeal to self-evident truths as kind of like a sort of given that everyone could agree on, what I was saying is that no self-evident truths are worldview independent. So that anything you claim that is self-evidently true is going to only have meaning and cogency within a worldview context. And if you don't share the same worldview, then these aren't self-evident. Even if you agree on the surface, when you dig a little deeper as to one's broader worldview context, there's not going to be an agreement in principle. There might be an agreement in practice. We all start with logic and this, that, and the other thing. But in principle, there's actually a diametrical difference because we don't have the same context that we're operating under.
It'll be the same token, but a different framework.
I think Darth...
Let me just make a quick comment. There are recordings of me where morons on the internet tape me, and then they'll take isolated quotes where I'll say that nothing is self-evident. And then another video, I'll say, well, it's self-evident. Well, Eli just clearly explained, elucidated what we're talking about. There are no self-evident truths that are worldview independent. There can be self-evident truths within the one true worldview of the God of the Bible, but there are no self-evident truths that are worldview independent. Well said, Eli.
When Eli was explaining that self-evident truths are worldview independent, Darth thought he had found an escape route to the apparent contradiction. He tried to say that unless someone adopts his specific ultimate foundation, their appeal to self-evident truths collapses. Darth's claim to Eli was that no self-evident truths exist independently of the Christian worldview. In his framework, anything that seems obvious, logic, identity, causality, moral intuition, even basic perceptual certainty, only appears self-evident because the Christian God made it so. Therefore, according to him, anyone outside Christianity who claims something is self-evident is actually relying on Christian metaphysics without realizing it. That's his entire "you're borrowing from my worldview" maneuver. But here's the problem. That argument only works if Darth's worldview is itself clearly defined, stable, and complete, meaning he must have a single coherent account of what the Christian God even is. And this is precisely where his 14 minimalist lists completely destroy his own reasoning. Why his position collapses. If self-evident truths depend entirely on the necessary attributes of the Christian God, then Darth must know exactly what those necessary attributes are. Yet he has 14 different, mutually inconsistent, constantly changing lists of what supposedly counts as the necessary preconditions of intelligibility. None of these lists even contain the Trinity, even though he claims the Trinity is mandatory for Christianity and is what makes Christianity uniquely capable of grounding intelligibility. Because his lists differ on which attributes are essential, Darth cannot tell us what the actual grounding of intelligibility is. If even he doesn't know which attributes are necessary, then his own framework cannot supply what he claims the Christian worldview provides, a single, definite, ultimate foundation. This produces the fatal contradiction. He says, self-evident truths don't exist unless they are grounded in the Christian God. But the Christian God, in his system, is a blurry, unstable, constantly shifting concept with no fixed definition. Therefore, by Darth's own standard, his worldview fails to provide the intelligibility he claims others lack. The irony is brutal. The argument he used to block Eli, self-evident truths require my clearly defined Christian God, backfires, like a boomerang with razor blades attached to it, because his definition of God is something Gary has failed, both then and now, to present to anyone. Because based on his inconsistent definitions, He can't provide anything substantive or coherent, especially according to his own definitions. Chapter 5. Gary's Claim About God versus Chance. Ladies and gentlemen, please listen carefully to the following statement Darth made about the biblical God versus chance, which is a concept he often refers to in his arguments with unbelievers.
Deeply held religious commitments and need not apply it to a personal deity. So your deeply held religious commitment is whatever your ultimate concern is, or whatever you consider to be the foundation of everything. Okay?
Okay, so I mean, I guess if that's how you define worship, then yeah, everybody worships something, sure.
Yeah. So your God is chance. Charles Darwin said this. Charles
not
Darwin
my God,
said,
but just what I worship, I guess. But I don't think I worship chance.
Your ultimate source is chance, not God.
I mean, how you think that's a true dichotomy? It's either God or chance?
Yes.
Gary presents this as a true dichotomy, meaning he claims these are the only two logically possible options. But this claim is not merely wrong, it is a mischaracterization of what a true dichotomy actually is. This error is an extremely elementary logical mistake, one that any first-semester philosophy student would immediately recognize as being incorrectly structured. A true dichotomy must exhaust all possibilities. A proper dichotomy is a logical fork where no third option is even possible. Examples of true dichotomies: something either exists or does not exist. A statement is either true or not true. A number is either even or odd. Anything presented as a dichotomy must cover all logically possible alternatives. Gary's chance or God does not cover all logically possible alternatives, so it's actually a false dichotomy. And here's the demonstrable fact, based on what we have already went over. Gary doesn't even have a coherent God category to contrast with chance. He can't form a true dichotomy when he doesn't know, can't define, or can't even correctly articulate either side of it. Chapter 6. The Claim About No Common Ground with an Atheist. Ladies and gentlemen, I am going to briefly repeat part of a conversation we already went over. It is an extract from the conversation Darth had with Eli Ayala.
Okay, go ahead, Eli.
Well, I was saying that when people appeal to self-evident truths as kind of like a sort of given that everyone could agree on, what I was saying is that no self-evident truths are worldview independent. So that anything you claim that is self-evidently true is going to only have meaning and cogency within a worldview context. And if you don't share the same worldview, then these aren't self-evident. Even if you agree on the surface, there's not going to be an agreement in principle.
Notice that in that clip, they both suggest that no self-evident truths are worldview independent. Anything you claim as self-evidently true only has meaning within a worldview. If a believer and an atheist have different worldviews, they cannot agree, in principle, on any concept that is treated as a shared starting point. This means there are no worldview-neutral shared starting points, no shared givens, no shared definitions, no common ground with an atheist at a metaphysical level. This idea is further supported by some of Gary's own statements as follows.
I do not agree with anything in your worldview, okay?
Can we agree that some...
I cannot agree because we have two different worldviews. So any
I don't have a worldview.
Okay,
Can we agree that something cannot
that doesn't
come
answer
from
the
nothing?
question.
Can we agree that something cannot come from nothing?
I can't agree with you because your worldview doesn't have a foundation.
Neither does yours.
Why does this represent a problem in Gary's fundamentalist apologetics? On one hand, Gary takes the position that no conceptual starting points, self-evident truths, definitions, meaning structures, can be shared between people with different worldview, and that there cannot exist any common ground. On the other hand, Gary suggests, even mandates, that a shared definition of God is possible and required before discussing whether that God actually exists.
Me saying to an atheist, can we agree on this minimalist definition of God, is not by any stretch of the imagination pluralism.
So you're using the word God to refer to the same thing.
Yeah, right? So that we can communicate. When I talk to atheists and I say, here's a minimalist definition of God, can we work with that? okay, that any God that we discuss, believe or disbelieve in, would minimally have these characteristics, okay? All I'm simply saying is here's a definition that we can use, right? Now, we can discuss what we say to them, and you're right. We can say, if we both come to an agreement that there is a creator God, then we can discuss what extended attributes that God may or may not have. But until we come to a resolution as to what is fundamental, the source of possibility, it is extraneous and a distraction to talk about God's extended properties before we are agreed upon that there's a creator.
He insists that before any conversation can happen, both sides must agree on a minimalist definition of God as ultimate, absolute creator source of all possibility/impossibility. He says this agreement is necessary or we can't converse. This assumes that there are shared conceptual anchors, at least one shared neutral definition that both people can access and agree on, independent of worldview commitment. This is a direct violation to Van Til's apologetics and to the entire presuppositional apologists' framework. If no truth or concept is worldview independent, then a minimalist definition cannot exist or be shared. This means Darth destroys the very precondition he claims is necessary to begin any conversation. On one hand, Gary's position is that the unbeliever cannot possibly understand or share self-evident truths in any principled sense. Yet, Darth requires them to agree on it when suggesting that they can agree on his minimalist definition of God, whatever that may be. Chapter 7. The core. Irony. Gary defines his God as something that cannot be defined. When cornered, Darth hides behind, "It's a minimalist list. It's not meant to be exhaustive. You don't need every detail. It's just what is logically necessary." But every time you examine his list, it changes, or expands, or contracts, or contradicts the previous version, or introduces new categories, or removes attributes that cause problems.
Fine. So when you approach an atheist and you say, I'm giving the minimalist definition for God, right? I take the minimalist definition to mean that you are going to be presenting only the necessary qualities of God. However...
No, that's not what I'm doing.
Oh, really? What do you mean by minimalist then?
I mean a bare minimum of a definition that a person will accept as a working term.
Right.
It doesn't necessitate, okay, the fact that I am not invoking other characteristics does not mean that they're necessarily excluded. I'm simply dealing with their belief system. Okay, they disbelieve in all gods. Okay, not just the Christian God.
You're saying to them, I'm using the minimalist definition for God, but you don't actually think that's the minimalist definition.
That's the base properties of the God of the Bible.
Thus, he defines his ultimate as a moving target, a shifting concept with no fixed identity, a God with no stable attribute set, a definition with no boundaries, an ontology with no content, an epistemology with no foundation. Darth's God becomes a philosophical vapor, invoked when convenient, avoided when examined. The so-called ultimate foundation of intelligibility becomes a definition that cannot be defined, and that destroys his entire apologetic at its core. So what do we have? A worldview that claims to provide absolute certainty, yet contains contradictory attribute lists, permanent epistemic gaps, circular dependencies, inconsistent application, and real-world uncertainty about basic facts. This isn't an external critique. This is Darth's worldview collapsing under its own definitions. If your system requires an ultimate, perfect, complete foundation, but the system you defend is incomplete, internally inconsistent, and epistemically limited, then your transcendental argument never gets off the ground. The conclusion is simple. Darth's worldview cannot provide the intelligibility he claims it does, not because atheism refutes it, but because it refutes itself. Ladies and gentlemen, in closing, when we step back and look at the dozen-plus minimalist definitions Darth has given, his 17-core attribute list of what he claims are indivisible, inseparable attributes, When we look at how Darth separates and divides the very attributes he claims cannot be divided or separated, when we look at Gary's statement, when he said that he did not know what his God was doing, sans creation, because that hasn't been revealed. When we look at Gary's statement where he admitted that he did not know if physics is everywhere in the universe, but insists that atheists have to, and do know it, inherently, all of this, plus layer upon layer of dozens of contradictory statements he passes off as just misquotes or taking him out of context. When we look at Gary's multiple performative contradictions, we begin to see exactly what Greg Bahnsen spent years warning students about. Any position that is inconsistent, arbitrary, or constantly shifting is automatically disqualified as a legitimate Christian apologetic. Bahnsen repeatedly taught that the moment you start redefining God using man-made philosophical categories or adjusting your definitions on the fly, you have already stepped outside the biblical worldview and into self-contradiction. And this is precisely where Gary's approach collapses. The instability of his definitions isn't just a tactical problem. It places him in direct conflict with Van Til and Bahnsen themselves. When Gary simultaneously claims that there is no common ground between believer and unbeliever, he has embraced a position the founders of presuppositionalism would consider fundamentally unbiblical. In fact, Van Til and Bahnsen would regard this move, redefining God apart from Scripture, appealing to neutral ground, and borrowing categories from unbelieving philosophy, as a form of theological error, even bordering on heresy. Everything presented in this video expose is a straightforward application of presuppositional apologetics based on Gary's own methods, claims, statements, and arguments, a position he has referred to as being a nuclear strength worldview, a worldview that he says no atheist or unbeliever has defeated. Ladies and gentlemen, I want to close with one final question, and here it is. Based on what you have watched and heard in this video, would you consider Gary's version of presuppositional apologetics, his worldview, as being something you would tell your child, or even your parents, to base their entire existence on? Please feel free to post your comments in the area below. Please subscribe if you have not already done so, and thank you for watching.
One of the two great intellectual sins that men commit, no matter what field of study you're in, is arbitrariness. The other one is inconsistency. No one is allowed to be arbitrary if you're trying to present a rational basis for what you believe. And no one is being rational in presenting a basis for what they believe if they contradict themselves, if they're inconsistent.